He is a man who's an intriguing kind of mix, not necessarily contradictions, but he basically occupies a lot of space and a lot of contrary devices are used in his songwriting.
That man has also dramatically and repeatedly redefined rock and roll since the 70s. With a career marked by constant reinvention, he's David Bowie. Paul Trynka has written a new biography that tries to shed light on the person behind the music. It's Paul Trynka, author of David Bowie, Starman, on today's Words and Music from Studio A. Hi, this is Dennis Elsis. David Bowie embodies the fact that, like other great megastars, the more status he attains, the more unknowable he seems to get. And it's made even more challenging given his frequent shape-shifting. But in David Bowie's Starman, author Paul Trynka grapples with Bowie's music, career, and life with detailed research. Bowie's life is well known, his humble music beginnings until his first hit in 1969 with Space Oddity, his subsequent almost inexhaustible musical output, his shifting personas like Ziggy Stardust and the Thin White Duke, his sexual ambiguity, and his self-destructive drug addiction. Trynka claims that throughout it all, Bowie was a musical genius and also a shrewd businessman who grasped the concept that stardom was a theatrical, vaudevillian endeavor. Paul Trynka came into the studio to speak with me about his book, and we started at the beginning. You start the book off not at the point that I was expecting. It's interesting. I think of Bowie, and I think of hearing the first Bowie song that I think of hearing is Space Oddity. That's where I first get familiar with the name David Bowie. And yet your book begins with Starman, the song, with the performance on the BBC, and you say that that is a very pivotal moment, perhaps the most important moment in the very beginning of his career.
I think it is, because that was the point at which everything came together, at which he recreated himself. Because strangely enough, after Space Oddity, he was dismissed as one-hit wonder. And coming back from that was probably harder than having his first hit. So this performance of Starman on Top of the Pops in the UK, it was a huge show where, grannies and grandpas would sit down with their kids, and here's one guy who managed to package up all this outrage into sort of 2 or 3 minutes. The song is Starman. Starman's lifted from the song Over the Rainbow, so it's kind of got all these familiar elements. And then about 2 minutes in, he drapes his arm around Mick Ronson. It's a beautiful bit of theatre, because, what he's doing is kind of launching his claim to fame, to being a kind of bisexual icon. He looks like he's from Mars, literally, so people across the country were, outraged. All the kids were completely entranced. So that was a really big moment in his career, exactly as big as the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And it was at that point that everybody knew it was going to happen. And in those 3 minutes, that almost encapsulates everything about him.
I was very intrigued in reading the opening about Starman with the comparison to Judy Garland, Over the Rainbow. And I mentioned it on the air the other day, and I was trying to sort of cross-segue the two. But for listeners, what should they be listening to? Where is Starman, where is Rainbow, and where do they intersect?
Well, the actual line, there's a Starman, links up with somewhere over the rainbow. There's an octave leap, and it sits over the same chord sequence. What's interesting is that whole technique that he's using there. It's a very old school, traditional 1940s songwriting technique. And so what it really shows, that one song encapsulates both how radically new he was, and at the same time he was traditional. He came from a showbiz background. He's born in Brixton, where kind of vaudeville entertainers used to hang out and carry their violin cases around. So he is a man who's just an intriguing kind of mix, not necessarily with contradictions, but he basically occupies a lot of space, and a lot of contrary devices are used in his songwriting.
Somewhere over the rainbow, there's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He's told us not to blow it, 'cause he knows it's all worthwhile. He told me, let the children use it, let the children use it. Starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He's told us not to blow it, 'cause he knows it's all worthwhile. He told me, let the children lose it, let the children use it, let all the children boogie. Starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He's told us not to blow it, 'cause he knows it's all worthwhile. He told me, let the children lose it, let the children use it, let all the children boogie.
That was David Bowie's Starman from 1972. Davy Jones becomes David Bowie. That's the first question, because for folks who here were in America, they knew that there was a Davy Jones, but he was becoming a monkey. And who figured out that there was a need for a name change, and why?
Well, I think David had always fantasized about name changes, so he'd tried a couple on, and he kept even doing things like changing the spelling of his first name. But then there was a key figure in his career called Ken Pitt, who was part of the sort of the kind of campy London management scene. Very intelligent guy, worked with Manfred Mann, and David's then manager, Ralph Horton, had actually asked Ken to take over management. He thought David needed pushing more, and Ken said, well, I'm not sure, but one thing you should do is change the guy's name. And so instantly, if you actually look at the paperwork, within a day or two, David had decided on David Bowie, and that was it. Never looked back.
I mean, we've read these stories about fascination with the Alamo or anything like that, having seen a film. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think there is, actually. He, according to one of his friends from the Conrads, the drummer, David Hadfield, he said that he was quite obsessed, that he used to wear those kind of buckskin jackets with the strands on. And, he was definitely influenced by the Bowie knife. And also it just had it did sound like a star's name, and he definitely had an instinct for that.
So you mentioned the Conrads, and if we go through early Bowie Jones history, there's King Bees and Manish Boys and Lower Third. How does all of this ultimately culminate in Space Oddity? Well,
it takes a long time. The interesting, fascinating thing about David Bowie is he started out and he was a charismatic kid. People liked him. Music biz managers really liked him. You know, he was quite capable of working his wiles on people and entrancing them, especially if they happened to be gay. But in the early days, the music just wasn't very good. And really the premise of this book is that a lot of his life up to 1970, 1971 was him actually accumulating all the skills. He wasn't born with them. He was undeniably a genius by the time we get to 1971, 1972, if you look at just the quality of the output and the sheer creativity there. But yeah, in the Conrads, he was undistinguished. The King Bees single is awful. Manish Boys did a nice record that happened to be a cover version. You know, so more than any of his peers, it took him a long time to get going. But that early period is fascinating because it shows him going right to the heart of the music industry in London, making friends with the right people. You know, there are kind of revelations in the book, like the fact he played with the Small Faces for a few days. He did all their early gigs. Nobody's ever mentioned this or known this before, and they threw him out because they thought he was too derivative. At the time, he was obsessed with Bob Dylan, so he'd sound like, Bob Dylan one day, Bobby Bland the next day, and he hadn't really fixed on the person he was going to become. It took him a long time.
The song Space Oddity, how did that come about? Was it as calculated as we're led to believe, that it was timed to be launched right around the time that the mission to the moon was launched?
There was certainly an amount of cynicism around the way it was marketed, and David was smart enough to realise what potential that had. But funnily enough, one of the most mysterious personalities in David's life called me a few weeks ago, Hermione Farthingale, was this very beautiful red-haired woman who was his girlfriend at the time, and she was just saying it was I'd had the story in the book, and I'd said that it was the song's kind of shot through with a certain kind of sadness, and it was in the book I'd actually said that it was because they were separating and perhaps she was leaving him. In fact, that is what happened. She'd gone off and got a job, I think, in Norway, but she'd said the song was primarily just inspired by the stylophone, that little cheap keyboard. He just played two notes a semitone apart, just that, and that inspired the kind of minor sad tonality of the song, and he just developed the song as a story. He had the idea in his head. He'd seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, but he wrote the song like a play. It's very different from other people's songwriting. That one in particular, it kind of develops like a play script, and he manages it masterfully. And a lot of the guitar chords are kind of improvised. They just support the story. And but yeah, it all came from that feeling of just sadness and the kind of slightly nasal alien tone of the stylophone. That's what inspired it.
When you wrote that description of the stylophone, and you speak about it wonderfully, as the whole book is, because the book is, let me say, first and foremost, a Bowie fan's delight. And even if you know nothing about David Bowie, before you pick it up, you'll learn a lot, and you go through it also both historically and culturally. So there's a nice meshing of the rock and roll music history with the cultural history, and of course Bowie's history. And in the portion where you write about the stylophone, I'm immediately taken to, did you see the concert for New York after 9/11? There was a concert at Madison Square Garden, and everyone from McCartney to The Who to Neil Young to Bowie performed. And Bowie is, if not the opening act, but I think he is, sitting at what appears to be a very tiny piano that may in fact be a stylophone for all I know.
I think I've seen it on YouTube. It could well be a stylophone because he bought one again quite recently, exactly around that time. So he also bought an old EMS synth that I think might have even been Brian Eno's from when he made Low. So depending on how small it is, it's either the stylophone or this little cranky old synthesizer.
So if you go to in my case, the album, the CD, I can hear it now. The beginning, he plays Simon & Garfunkel's America, and it has and it's the opening of the show, and it's the very same sad, plaintive. And it's funny, I hadn't thought of that connection ever. So interesting for me that it came around that way. So Bowie has a hit, Space Oddity, which becomes a bigger hit in the UK long before it became a hit here, right?
Exactly, yeah. It kind of died a death in the US because it was just too negative and depressive. At a time when America was sending people to the moon, the song about an astronaut lost in space didn't go down that well.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your protein pills and put your helmet on. Ground control to Major Tom. 8, 7, 6. Commencing countdown, engines on. 3, 2. Check ignition and may God's love be with you. This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade, and the papers want to know whose shirts you wear. Now it's time to leave the capsule if you dare. As Major Tom to ground control, I'm stepping through the door, and I'm floating in a most peculiar way, and the stars look very different today, for here am I sitting in a tin can.
Space Oddity, Bowie's first hit from 1969. The other song that came to my attention early on, before we all learned about the Bowie from RCA Records, was that very odd and very almost cosmic track, Memory of a Free Festival.
That was a lovely song, and I had quite a lot in the book about the recording of that. It was recorded soon after his dad died, so that song is really about Bowie's place in the hippie movement. So he'd kind of gone along with the underground and the hippie movement in 1969, and that gave him a forum, but he wasn't really part of it. And what's interesting is a lot of the time in Bowie's history, he kind of jumps on a kind of cultural bandwagon, but he's apart from it. He's commenting on it as an observer. And Memory of a Free Festival is exactly that. It's almost a dream of a day that could have been, that wasn't.
So it wasn't inspired by a...
it was inspired by, he'd played a free festival in Bromley, and it was part of the Arts Lab project that he'd put together. But the concert itself happened, I think, about 4 or 5 days after his dad's funeral. And, you know, it's interesting because pop stars' stories are often filled with kind of bickering. I know I've read other articles where people said how unpleasant and he was that day, and just because people all wanted a piece of him, and he was suffering from stage fright and still in grief for his dad. He was a major character in his life. And so that song itself is about this festival that was both a blissful time and a very sad, poignant one as well. And I think that comes through in the song.
So Starman is the beginning of the change, the beginning of the transition. And you say early on in the book that Bowie will say that Little Richard was his idol. And I found that very interesting.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? If you look at Little Richard and you look at how outrageous he was, you look at the way that Little Richard would make these little symphonies in 2.5 minutes using the best session musicians of the time, and the way Little Richard just pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable visually. And of course, Little Richard was pretty camp, all that makeup. And so I think Little Richard at the same time was this mix of the authentic and then also the veneer of showbiz, etc. And in many ways, I think that was a touchstone for Bowie more than anybody else. He was more akin to Little Richard than he was to people like Muddy Waters. And so it wasn't really until the 1970s when people actually even started. There was a kind of 50s revivalism, and in some ways that inspired the launch of glam in the UK as well. So Little Richard right through his career has been a touchstone. And I think even today he owns some of his suits, which are apparently massively big.
And not just the musical, but I guess also the physical, right?
In terms of
the makeup and the certain persona and the ambiguity of the sexuality and things like that.
Absolutely, I think that Little Richard's the whole package that you get with Little Richard, of the suits, how camp he is, the makeup, just the sheer showbiz vitality, also the competitiveness. Little Richard, his act was kind of honed through cutting contests in the South, where he'd be up against Ray Charles or whoever. He'd make sure he came out on top. It was a really old school kind of ambition, and that ambition runs right through all of the glam movements. So you had people like Bowie and Bolan and Brian Ferry, and they were all competing with each other, and they all wanted to be top dog. And that's not a bad thing. That was a good thing, because it resulted in some great music.
So take us through the, so to speak, changes. I mean, and if ever, all these years later, there was a song that marks his career. Interestingly enough, it's one of the earliest of the RCA days that song changes, because it's more than any other, I think, rock and roll star that I've observed over the last 30 or 40 years. David Bowie has had more persona, or personas, if whatever's the correct way of doing it, than just about anyone else.
Yeah, Changes is a beautiful song. And for me, the album that stands at the centre of his career is definitely Hunky Dory, on which features that song. And at that point, David had completely recreated himself, and it wasn't even just a change on the outside, it was a change on the inside. For instance, he'd stopped writing on guitar, he just learned the piano. That meant the songs were written in a completely different way, so he would spend hours and hours going over all these runs on the piano obsessively. By that time, he'd teamed up with Angie Bowie, and she created this cocoon for him. So she'd run his bath, she'd make him cups of tea, she'd light his cigarettes for him, run out to the shops, and then she'd basically field all the phone calls when he was busy. And out of that, this album has this fantastic sense of rebirth. There's almost a childlike quality to me, and obviously in songs like Kooks, and it's about just exploring new possibilities and actually the fact that you can be who you want to be. So in many ways that song does exactly, it lays the foundation for David's career. But those changes, as I say, they weren't just him putting on a different outfit or a different haircut. He actually changed the way he operated, and many people don't understand that. He'd changed himself from an ambitious kid who didn't have a lot of talent to somebody who was a creative powerhouse. And then he wrote songs in one kind of way, and then he dropped all of that and wrote songs in a completely different kind of way. He changed the way he recorded. He changed the musicians with whom he worked. So whilst he was very ruthless with the people around him, and that's a part of the story too, there's this incredible ruthlessness with himself, just to burn his bridges so there's no going back, get himself out of his comfort zone. So the more you find out about it, in a way, I think the more exciting that period is.
And my time was running wild, a million dead-end streets, and every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet. So I turn myself to face me, but I've never caught a glimpse how the others must see the faker. I'm much too fast to take that test. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. It's gonna have to be a different man. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. Sides, but never leave the stream of warm permanent sand. So the days float through my eyes, but still the days seem the same. And these children that you spit on as they try to change their worlds are immune to your consultations. They're quite aware of what they're going through. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't tell them to grow up out of it. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Where's your shame? You've left us up to our next event. Time may change me, but you can't trace time. Strange fascination fascinating me. Our changes are taking the pace I'm going through. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Oh, look out, you rock and rollers. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Pretty soon now you're gonna get older. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. I said that time may change me, but I can't trace time.
Changes, released in 1971. This is Dennis Elsas talking with author Paul Trynka, who's written a new book about David Bowie called Starman, here at WFUV. You are a Bowie fan, and I'm sure one would say a Bowie expert. So in doing all of the research, and based on what I've read in the book, it's exhaustive. What's the biggest surprise? Did you learn anything new in doing all of this?
I think the biggest surprise for me, particularly as we've been talking about Hunky Dory, is how actually some of his greatest breakthroughs he did completely solo. We always think of him as somebody who was surrounded by other people. But at Hunky Dory, his band had left him. Again, people didn't particularly know this. They thought that Tony DeFries, David's manager, had sent Mick Ronson and the others back to Hull. He hadn't. They'd just given up on him. David actually had recreated himself in isolation. Here is a man who did, ultimately, whilst he always relied on other musicians, when all else failed, he could just deliver it on his own and just put himself in a very creative space. So, in a way, that was almost a transformation at the centre of the book. But there were just so many other surprises. The stories of how a lot of those songs from Load came about. The whole story of how The Idiot happened was completely new. And then personal details like how early his marriage with Angie was doomed. We always think of it from the outside as they're having a fairly decent marriage until 1977, but their marriage was doomed from his first US tour. So, he got tired of Angie. She became a distraction after having been the woman who kind of nursemaided his success. She became surplus to requirements, not just in his view, in everybody's view, really early on. So at the centre of that, there's actually some very sad human stories as well.
First silly question of the interview. Urban myth. Can we finally discuss whether Angie by the Stones has anything to do with Angie and Bowie and Jagger and...
Okay, Angie by the Stones I don't think has got anything to do with Angie, and I've discussed that with Keith Richards as well. Angie does float the notion in her book, but she doesn't really offer any evidence. At the same time in the book she also talks about finding David and Mick in bed together, and that's exactly the kind of revelation that publishers ask for in the book, but no, it would have never happened. Angie herself kind of basically explained why it couldn't have happened when she talked about whether David and Iggy had ever slept together, and her question was who'd be on the bottom. Nobody would be on the bottom because they were both top dogs, so just from a practical viewpoint it wasn't going to happen.
You introduce a very important aspect of his career and about what you have written, and that has to do with sexuality and with gay and bisexuality and ambiguity.
I think, yes, he was bisexual. He always was bisexual. He was just interested in pushing the boundaries, even as a kid. I think also it was just part of his exploration of people. So, when he was interested in people, he wanted to find out how they worked. At the same time, it was just part of his image too, and so he exploited that for everything that it was worth. And what's quite interesting is once he's made his splash with his sexuality, that basically from that point on he leaves the boys and he just confines himself to girls. And at the time, as one of the guys in my book says, who lived in the same scene and did much the same things, he just said it was the 60s. You couldn't talk about something without having tried it.
You also infer or report that when early on he told Melody Maker, yes, I'm gay, that was quite calculated.
It was absolutely calculated, yes. It was part of a really well-worked-out manifesto that he'd worked up with his press assistant. And David had this idea that he was a kind of leader of a post-sexual society where all the old mores were dead, and the old idea of, working in a factory was dead, and there would be this new race of kids who'd be bisexual. They were the pretty things. And quite a lot of that whole premise in his manifesto, I think, was kind of manufactured and just a bit hokey and thrown together. But he sort of believed it long enough to construct a story about it. And it kind of contributed to his sense of destiny, and I think all the way through he did have this sense of destiny that he was championing a certain sector of people. So again, he was one of those people who'd get obsessed with something and then do it to the max. But when he came up with that manifesto, he said, I'm gay and always have been, it was multi-layered, it was funny, it was a joke, it was a piss take, as we'd say in England as well, but there was certainly a real core of sincerity about it.
So take us first from Mercury to RCA, and then take us from the man who sold the world to Hunky Dory to Ziggy.
Okay, well, from Mercury to RCA was a fascinating time because, of course, David had this hit with Space Oddity, but Mercury was a kind of strange agglomeration as a label because he was signed both to Mercury in the States, and then they were distributed via Philips in the UK, and so he was kind of stuck in the middle of the Atlantic, more or less. But what is really interesting is right away David has this foresight that he doesn't want to stay with a label that's doomed. It's been a step on the ladder. Now he wants to get to the next rung. He wants to be on Elvis Presley's label. And with his new manager, Tony DeFries, they engineered a brilliant bit of brinkmanship. They call the Mercury executives over for a meeting in London, and they just tell Mercury they're never going to record, that David will never record for them again. And what's fascinating about that meeting is the guys from Mercury were outraged, and they said, well, if that's the case, you've got to pay off. You've got to buy back all your albums if you want to leave the company. It meant he got the rights back to the Space Oddity album and The Man Who Sold the World. And then once they got a new deal with RCA, they sold them to RCA and made a profit. And so he was free to completely recreate himself on RCA with the results that we can hear.
Hunky Dory to Ziggy to Aladdin Sane, but probably Hunky Dory first to Ziggy because it's so major.
What's fascinating about Hunky Dory and Ziggy is that David, when he's reinventing himself in the way we've talked about, learning to play the piano and writing all those songs on the piano, same time he's come over to the States, to New York and the West Coast, he's discovered Iggy Pop. He was played Iggy Pop's or the Stooges' at a radio station in San Jose, and he was fascinated, and he came straight back to England. He found a college band who I interviewed, and again, people never knew they existed. They were called Runk, and he recorded his first version of Moon Age Daydream with them. So, and what's fascinating is all of this happens before Hunky Dory. So he's kind of taken all this music of the Velvets and the Stooges. He knows he wants to make something that's tough, that's rock and roll, that sounds like the Stooges with a bit of kind of 50s rock and roll mixed in. And he parks it. He just keeps all those songs safe, and then he records all of Hunky Dory that has its own kind of artistic unity. In the meantime, he's got Ziggy waiting in the wings. Ziggy just needs the outfit and the haircut and the wrestler's boots, and it just needs a couple more songs, and it was already waiting. So, as often happens throughout this period, David is kind of has one album out, and the other one's already there. It's already mapped out. It's fascinating.
Now Ziggy played guitar, jamming good with Weird and Gilly and the Spiders from Mars. He played it left hand, but made it too far. Became the special man, then we were Ziggy's band. Ziggy really sang, screwed up eyes and screwed down hairdo, like some cat from Japan. He could lick 'em by smiling, he could leave them to hang. They came on so loaded, man, well hung in snow white tan. So where were the spiders while the fly tried to break our bones? Well, just the beer like to guide us. So we bitched about his fans and should we crush his sweet hands.
And the theatrics of Ziggy, where does all of that come from?
Well, again, the theatrics of Ziggy come from a lot of different places. One of the main factors was a guy called Freddie Beretti, a gay wardrobe. He called himself a seamstress, and he could run up clothes. He used to sort of live in Haddon Hall for a while, and he crafted these jumpsuits, and the look was inspired by A Clockwork Orange. And David used to watch what in Britain was this kind of fascinating spectacle on Saturday afternoons, which was wrestling, and this kind of British showbiz wrestling was even more kind of camp than the US version, I'd say, because you'd have these ridiculous sort of pot-bellied men squeezed into leotards with these kind of brightly coloured boots. So David co-opted those as well. Got his hair cropped short. He also had skinny trousers. And again, what's interesting about all of that is you'll see the other glam people and or glitter rock as it was known then was established before Ziggy, but it's David who changed the look of it. He went from the flared pants to the skinny pants. He went from long hair to shorter hair, and thereafter, obviously, he crafted that fantastic Aladdin Sane carrot top.
Ziggy played guitar.
At the same time, he threw in lots of other bits of the image. A lot of it came from Iggy Pop, and we've seen how David tried to climb on top of his audience at Imperial College in London in the same way that Iggy had done at Cincinnati. And then bits of the Stardust legend relied on Vince Taylor, this mad English rock star who used to wander around Soho and Denmark Street with a crumpled map on which he'd marked out UFO landing sites. So David took from all those places and he managed to make them all into a coherent whole.
So not an accident that Ziggy rhymes with Iggy?
No, I think the simplest explanation is the correct one. Listen to Moon Age Daydream and listen to him say, "Keep your electric eye on me, babe," and then listen to Iggy singing, "She's got a TV eye on me," and it's an homage to Iggy, but done in a very particular way. The music isn't really that much like Iggy, but what he wanted was that kind of immediacy.
This morning, before we started this, I was listening to a whole bunch of music, and one of the songs was All the Young Dudes, which, of course, is a song that he wrote but he gave to Mott the Hoople. And as I'm listening to All the Young Dudes, which I've listened to and played 1,000 times, I'm thinking, well, that's very much a photograph of the period of time. And so why give that song away?
He'd written it for Mott the Hoople, and he was inspired by Mott the Hoople. He saw them as this kind of tough biker gang, which they weren't really. They were from the country. They were country boys from Hereford. But it's interesting that he did give the song away, because he's a guy who's very ambitious. And in fact, his publisher said at the time that if David had followed up Starman with All the Young Dudes, David would have been big beyond his comprehension. But at heart, he was a fan. He was a fan of Mott the Hoople, and he gave it to them. And it wasn't an exercise, as some have said, in kind of showing how big he was or owning them. It was just, that was an example of David, the unabashed rock and roll fan. And he'd written it for them. So, as we said, he's old school. It is showbiz to write songs for your friends, and that's what he did. And yeah, indeed, the Mott the Hoople's version is better than David's, however good David's is. That's the archetypal one, I think.
The challenge here is to, with limited time, try and make the leap through the many leaps that David makes in his career. So I'm going to push us along here, and we're going to go from Ziggy to Aladdin Sane to Pinups to Diamond Dogs, which almost is a trilogy, or if there's another word for it, because we'll lead up to Young Americans. But how's that whole period unfolding? How do we get from Ziggy to Aladdin to Pinups to Diamond Dogs?
Well, by the time of Pinups and then Diamond Dogs, you've got a fantastic sense of impending crisis within the organisation. David has basically become the centre of a circus of the Main Man organisation, and the money is hemorrhaging all the time. So Main Man are signing a lot more artists, including people like Iggy, but then lots of fairly forgettable people as well. They've got delusions of grandeur. Tony DeFries wants to open a movie company, and the money's disappearing really fast. At the same time, right during the recording of Diamond Dogs, David discovers cocaine, and it's a kind of ultimately, he's taking it for a lot of reasons, one of which it's just a hip drug. It's what the Stones take. At the time, people just thought it would raise their mental game, make them smarter, without necessarily any downside. And all the way through Diamond Dogs, you've got a kind of growing intensity of sound, a sense of kind of chaos around it. You've also got David, who's by now becoming separated from his lieutenants like Mick Ronson, so he wants to prove that he can work without Mick Ronson. He also wants to claim that he's playing guitar on all of Diamond Dogs, which again in the book we show is not the case. That we find out that great songs like Rebel Rebel are actually played by a session guitarist who played with Serge Gainsbourg, and he polished up the riff and played it, even though David very publicly claimed to have done so. And there's just got this fantastic mesh of lots of different strands of his career, all basically coming apart, and you can hear that in the music, and in a way that's what makes it better. It's not as safe, it's not polite, it's not considered, it's chaotic.
And then we go from the glam rocker, from the makeup and from the various incarnations and the poses, and suddenly we're in Sigma Studios and we're in Philadelphia, and it's the sound of Young America and the Young Americans in golden years, and that seems like a total transition. Yeah,
well, what's great about David, again, is, as we said before, he operates on instinct. So if he finds something, then he goes for it. He doesn't actually spend too much time worrying about it.
They pulled in just behind the bridge. He lays her down. He frowns. Gee, my life's a funny thing. Am I still too young? He kissed her then and there. She took his ring, took his babies. It took him minutes, took her nowhere. Heaven knows he'd have taken anything. All night. She was a young American.
He'd moved to America. He wanted to conquer America. So to some extent, you can look at that music and say, well, it kind of all makes sense. You can see he's thinking about the business opportunities there. It's another kind of little trick in all of his songs is to name check the audience. So in The Pretty Things, he name checks his audience, and then in Young Americans he name checks his audience. This is aimed at young Americans. He's also lifting his his style of lyric writing wholesale from the man who he thought was the greatest American rock and roll poet, which is Bruce Springsteen. David had seen him, I think, about a year before. Springsteen was living near Philly, and David took the whole lyrical style. If you think about how observational Young Americans is, where he describes the couple, and that's all taken from Bruce Springsteen. And then he has a really smoking hot band, and he just lets them do their thing. He doesn't interfere. He just creates the right mindset for his musicians. And by now he's making music in a completely different way. He's kind of improvising in the studio. It's not songs that he's worked at before, as he did with Hunky Dory. He's just snatching these moments out of the ether and kind of just living off the energy of his musicians and his enthusiasm for the music. So Young Americans, it was thrown together very quickly. Then we obviously have songs like Fame that were just kind of accidents that came together in the studio. But the genius of David by that point was he just knew when to roll with a good idea. So Fame was just this fantastic assemblage of bits and pieces, a bit of chord sequence that John Lennon did come up with, a bit of lyric, a bit of a tune that had come from a song John Lennon was singing, and the riff Carlos Alomar had contributed to a cover version they'd been playing live a few weeks before. And then David pulled it all together. And again, with Fame, you're looking at a song that's constructed in a completely different way from Space Oddity, in a completely different way from Changes, a completely different way from Starman. His writing, everything about it has changed completely.
Yeah, you even say that Lennon was fooling around with the piano and he was playing Shame, 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 and that Bowie may have misheard that.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, funnily enough, nobody spoke to all the people who were there in the studio at the time, apart from me. And Carlos Alomar had his own story of what happened. And then John Lennon was there with May Pang, and she'd seen a lot of what happened, and she was one of the few people who weren't abusing any substances. And then also Eddie Kramer, the engineer who'd worked with Hendrix a lot, was there on the session because he liked David and he knew John. And together, they all gave me the story of how that song was written, and it is one of those wonderful, exciting moments. The more you find out about it, the more thrilling the story of that song Genesis is.
Golden Years, Heroes. Again, two major songs, two major periods for him, sort of intertwined. The Berlin years.
The Berlin years were really one of the most wonderful sections to write. In a way, that's how I started the book, because I'd written an Iggy book before, and I'd found that most of the Bowie stories I'd read just didn't give me enough detail on what was actually happening in Berlin. What did they do? Where did they go? What were they chat to each other about? What were they like when they sat together in a room? How did they put those songs together? What inspired China Girl, which obviously was one of David's songs? And I'd found out a lot of that material for Iggy, and then I wanted to come back and basically nail it all for David. And it is a wonderful story, not just of a musical recreation, as we said before. It's the story of two guys who were casualties, terrible casualties. They were both walking embodiments of kind of Hollywood burnout, and the more you read, the more kind of hair-raising it is. With Iggy's state in particular, he was sleeping in a garage and stealing food, and David rescued him. And it's a bit like with Mott the Hoople, David genuinely loved Iggy. He loved what he represented, and he wrote great songs for The Idiot. And at the same time, as he wrote those great songs and experimented with those ideas, and that gave him what he needed to come up with Low. And again, with Low, he's putting songs together in a completely different way from Young Americans or Station to Station. He's just writing in a different way, in a new place, just sort of reveling in the novelty of what's going on. And those records still sound amazing today, and they still sound innovative and exciting.
The Thin White Duke, where does that come from?
The Thin White Duke, I think, was ultimately a product of David's obsession with cocaine. He was holed up in Hollywood watching black and white footage of World War II over and over and over. And out of this, he was reading obsessively about the Kabbalah. He was reading books like Morning of the Magicians, lots of books about the occult, about Himmler's quest for the Holy Grail and the spear that pierced Christ's side. And the more you read into it, the scarier it is. All of that was promoted really by the fact that David was having a crisis because he'd lost control of his own music. He's a man who'd done such a huge amount to market himself, to rebrand himself, to relaunch himself, to recreate his music. And right at the time that he started on Station to Station, he realised he had no rights over it, that Tony DeFries, his former manager, had control of all that material. And David had to give DeFries a piece of the action all the way through till 1982. And in a way, David Bowie was his music. That's what he lived for. An entire part of them had been stolen. So he was lost. And cocaine at that time was a way of evading all that kind of sense of loss.
Then in the 1980s, a whole new audience learns about David Bowie, and there's MTV, and there's Let's Dance, and once again, reinvention.
Let's Dance is a great story, and these days Let's Dance is not very well regarded, unjustly I'd say, because the key songs are terrific ones, and what we have there is another example of him coming up with a kind of sonic palette that would define the entire decade. So he's done it once, only 5 years before, with Low and Heroes, he's launched all of that sort of electronic music, and then with Let's Dance he gives us all of that really stripped down funky music, obviously based on Chic, but still totally original. And he's making music in a completely different way. There's a great interview with the wonderful Nile Rodgers, where by Let's Dance, Nile was almost doing everything. He was recruiting the musicians. He was laying down the groove. He was he was recording a lot of the music in the studio when David wasn't there. But there's a great period when David brought Nile to his house in Switzerland and just programmed Nile, just showed him lots of sleeves, just played him lots of bits of music. The way all those bits of music that Nile got played when they were just hanging out together, they all end up in Let's Dance. And how that happens is fascinating, because you can just look at Let's Dance and it's a bit like sampling. One bit comes from Henry Mancini, another bit comes from the Beatles or the Isley Brothers. And out of it, David has made this fantastically commercial song that finally breaks him worldwide.
It's been quiet the last 10 years. Bowie fans, you as a fan and as an author, probably wonder, where is he? What is he up to?
We've said, I think, a few times here that David in many ways is quite conventional. And one of the conventional devices of a showbiz career is the glorious retirement. And I do lay out in the book how he'd been thinking of retiring right from the late 80s. He'd actually had this fantasy that he would retire almost in a big puff of smoke and a sort of flash, and then the smoke would clear and the stage would be empty. And David had been trying to do that for a long time, but the problem was he didn't really come up with an album that was big enough for him to disappear behind. And then, of course, he had a heart attack in Germany, and I think that heart attack became that kind of de facto explosion behind which he retired. And it wasn't a decision he came to straight away, because he did appear on stage, some wonderful, very poignant appearances for Fashion Rocks, which is obviously an older, more senior man in that kind of Tony Bennett kind of way. And Mike Garson, his pianist, talks very movingly about that period. But ultimately, I think that the art of recreating himself and coming up with a new album material just requires a huge amount of energy. And he has a sense that if it's not good enough, he's going to sully what's gone before. So although my heart thinks that he will put out another album, I think my head tells me that the longer it is, the more unlikely it is that we'll hear something else, sadly.
Paul Trynka's book, David Bowie, Starman, the definitive biography of David Bowie, is out now, published by Little Brown & Company. Our session was engineered by Jeremy Rayner, and Words and Music from Studio A was produced today by Ave Carrillo. Visit our archives at wfuv.org to hear this program and more exclusive conversations and performances. Thanks for listening. I'm Dennis Elsis for WFUV in New York.